The Vaxian Empire had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years, and nobody dared to question their power, because they were simply too strong, and their ships could destroy entire planets in a matter of hours, and every species that tried to resist them was crushed without mercy and turned into slaves or worse. And the Empire controlled over 200 different alien species across thousands of star systems, and they believed nothing could ever challenge their supremacy, until one day, everything changed when a small blue planet at the edge of the galaxy decided to fight back. Ambassador Krellick stood in the Grand Council chamber on the capital world of the Empire, and his three eyes were wide with shock as he watched the transmission that had just arrived from a primitive world called Earth. And the message was playing on the giant holographic screen for all the council members to see, and everyone in the room was completely silent because they could not believe what they were hearing from this backward species that had barely left their own solar system. The human on the screen wore a military uniform, and his face was calm, but there was steel in his eyes, and his voice was steady as he spoke. And behind him, the blue and white planet Earth rotated slowly in the darkness of space, and Captain Jake Morrison looked directly at the camera as if he could see through it to the very heart of the Empire itself. And when he spoke, his words were clear and left no room for misunderstanding or negotiation. Jake said, "This is Captain Jake Morrison of the United Earth Defense Force," and he was speaking on behalf of all humanity, and he told them that the Empire had ignored every diplomatic message that Earth had sent over the past year, and the Empire had violated their territorial space multiple times without permission. And worst of all, the Empire had kidnapped 17 human beings and taken them away for what they called biological research and experiments, and humanity considered all of these actions to be acts of war and therefore effective immediately. Humanity was formally declaring war on the entire Vaxian Empire, and they would get their people back, and they would hold the Empire accountable for every crime committed against them. The transmission ended and the screen went dark, and for several long moments nobody in the council chamber spoke, because they were all too stunned to form words, and some of them thought it must be some kind of joke or mistake, because surely this primitive species could not be serious about declaring war on the most powerful empire in the entire galaxy. Supreme Commander Vaxtol was the first to break the silence, and he started laughing, and the sound was like rocks grinding together. And his mandibles clicked in amusement, and he said they cannot be serious because these humans had barely achieved spaceflight, and they did not have faster-than-light travel, and they had no energy shields and no graviton weapons, and their technology was thousands of years behind the Empire. And this was not a declaration of war but a suicide note. And the rest of the council joined in the laughter because it seemed absurd that such a weak species would dare to challenge them. But Ambassador Krellick did not laugh, and he felt something cold in his chest. And he had spent 3 full cycles observing humanity from a distance and studying their history and their culture, and what he had learned made him very afraid because these humans were different from every other species the Empire had ever encountered, and they had something dangerous that the Empire had forgotten over the millennia of easy conquest, and that something was the willingness to die for what they believed in. Krellick raised one of his hands and said they should take this threat seriously, and they should prepare their military forces immediately, because these humans were not like other species. And the council stopped laughing and looked at him like he had lost his mind, and High Chancellor Mixtar asked why they should fear a species that still used chemical rockets and primitive nuclear weapons, and Krellick tried to explain that humanity had been fighting wars among themselves for their entire existence, and they had refined the art of killing to a level that no other species could match. Because while the Empire had fought perhaps 5 major wars in 3,000 years, humanity had fought thousands of wars, and they knew nothing but conflict and survival. The council dismissed his warnings, and they said he was being paranoid and overly cautious, and they decided that this situation required a quick and brutal response to make an example of humanity, so that no other species would ever dare to challenge the Empire again. And within hours they gave orders to the Third Fleet, which consisted of 200 warships, and the fleet was commanded by Admiral Zexacor, who was known for her ruthless efficiency in crushing rebellions, and the orders were simple and clear, which was to travel to the human solar system and destroy all military capabilities, and if the humans did not surrender immediately, then the fleet was authorized to reduce their cities to ash and take the survivors as slaves. The Third Fleet prepared to depart, and the ships were massive and powerful, and each one was equipped with weapons that could crack a moon in half, and their shields could withstand the heat of a star, and the crews were confident, and many of them joked about how easy this mission would be, because fighting humans would be like crushing insects beneath their boots. And some of the younger officers were disappointed because they wanted a real challenge, and not just a simple extermination mission against primitives who could barely defend themselves. Admiral Zexcor stood on the bridge of her flagship called the Eternal Dominion, and she gave the order to enter hyperspace, and the fleet vanished from normal space in a flash of blue light, and they would arrive at Earth in less than 2 days, and she expected the humans would beg for mercy the moment they saw the fleet appear in their sky. And if they did not beg, then they would die, and either way this would be over quickly and the Empire would move on to more important matters. But Ambassador Krellick stood alone in the observation deck of the Council building, and he watched the stars, and he felt a deep sense of dread in his hearts because he knew something that the Council and the military commanders did not understand, which was that humanity had nothing to lose and everything to fight for, and cornered prey was always the most dangerous kind. And he wondered if the Empire had just made the biggest mistake in its 3,000-year history, and he feared they would all soon find out the answer to that question. Back on Earth, the governments of every nation had come together in unity for the first time in human history, and they had pooled all their resources and technology and military forces into one combined defense force, and Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center deep beneath the mountains of Colorado, and around him hundreds of officers and technicians worked at their stations, and the walls were covered with screens showing defensive positions throughout the solar system, and everyone knew that the Empire would respond to their declaration of war, and they knew the response would be overwhelming. And brutal Commander Linda Hayes stood next to Jake, and she asked him if he thought they had any chance of winning this fight. And Jake looked at the tactical display showing their defensive networks, and he said honestly he did not know if they could win, but he knew they could make the Empire pay a price they never expected, and humanity would show these aliens that humans do not go quietly into the night, and they fight and they die on their feet rather than live on their knees. And Linda nodded and said that was good enough for her. The word spread across Earth that war was coming, and people did not panic because they had known this moment might arrive ever since the Empire first made contact 5 years ago. And every factory had been converted to military production, and every resource was dedicated to building weapons and ships and defenses, and millions of volunteers joined the military, and civilians built bunkers and prepared for the worst because humanity had been preparing for this war from the very first day. They learned they were not alone in the universe. The Third Fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the solar system, and their sensors immediately began scanning for targets, and they saw the small blue planet orbiting a yellow star, and they saw primitive satellites and space stations, and everything looked exactly as expected for a species that had barely left their homeworld. And Admiral Zexcor smiled and ordered the fleet to advance toward Earth, and she sent a message demanding immediate surrender, and she gave the humans 1 hour to comply or face total destruction. But the humans did not respond with words, and instead, they responded with action. Admiral Krellick stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion and watched the tactical displays as the Third Fleet moved deeper into the human solar system, and everything seemed quiet and peaceful, and the blue planet grew larger on the view screens, and he felt uneasy, because something about this situation did not feel right, and the humans had not responded to their surrender demand, and there was no panic or chaos visible from their scans, and it was almost as if the humans were waiting for something. Supreme Commander Vaxtol sat in the command throne, and he was reviewing the sensor data, and he ordered the tactical officer to report on human military positions, and the officer's tendrils trembled slightly as he worked his controls, and he said there were vessels in the system, but they were reading strange signatures, and they appeared to be simple chemical propulsion craft with no energy shields and no advanced weapons, and just primitive ballistic technology. And Vaxtol laughed and said they were sending fireworks against the might of the Empire, and this battle would be over before it even began. But then the tactical display suddenly erupted with warning signals, and alarms blared throughout the bridge, and the sensor officer shouted that thousands of objects were launching from multiple positions, and they were coming from behind the moon, and from asteroid clusters and from orbital stations that had appeared empty just moments before, and the objects were missiles and kinetic weapons, and there were so many of them that they filled the display like a swarm of angry insects, and the numbers kept climbing higher and higher. Admiral Krellick shouted for all ships to take evasive action and raise shields to maximum, but the Vaxian fleet was not designed for this kind of attack, and their ships were built to fight other advanced civilizations with energy weapons and graviton torpedoes, and their defensive systems were calibrated to stop sophisticated attacks and not simple mass moving at high velocity. And the point defense systems tried to engage the incoming missiles, but there were too many targets, and the computers could not track them all. The first impacts began, and a destroyer on the fleet's outer edge shuddered as tungsten rods punched through its hull like paper, and the rods were traveling at thousands of kilometers per second, and they carried no explosives because they did not need them, and the kinetic energy alone was enough to tear through armor and shields, and the destroyer broke apart in a flash of fire and debris, and its crew died before they even understood what had hit them. More missiles reached the fleet, and these ones carried nuclear warheads, and they detonated against the shields of the larger cruisers, and the explosions were crude and primitive, but they were also incredibly powerful, and the shields flickered and failed under the bombardment, and once the shields were down, the follow-up kinetic rounds punched through the exposed hulls, and the cruisers began to list and tumble as their engines died, and atmosphere vented into space. Vaxtol screamed orders, but nobody could hear him over the chaos, and the bridge shook as their own. Ship took hits and systems began failing all around them, and the lights flickered and sparks flew from damaged consoles, and one of the tactical officers was thrown from his station when an explosion tore through the lower deck, and Krelix held onto his console and watched in horror as ship after ship on the tactical display changed from green to red, indicating they were destroyed or disabled. Commander Linda Hayes sat in the command center of the UEDF Roosevelt, which was hidden in the shadow of Mars, and she watched the tactical feed showing the battle, and every missile that launched had been tracked and plotted months in advance, and humanity had turned every rock and piece of space debris in the solar system into a weapon, and they had used their inferior technology in ways the Empire never imagined possible. And she smiled coldly and gave the order for all batteries to fire at will, and told her people to make every shot count. The human strategy was simple but effective, and they knew they could not match the Empire's advanced technology, so they did not try. And instead, they used what they had, which was numbers and determination and creativity, and they had built thousands of simple missiles using basic materials, and they had hidden them throughout the solar system. And when the Empire's fleet entered their trap, they unleashed everything at once, and the Vaxian ships found themselves drowning in a sea of projectiles that their sophisticated systems were never designed to handle. A Vaxian battlecruiser tried to maneuver away from the missile storm, but it was too slow and too large, and dozens of kinetic impactors slammed into its engine section, and the fusion reactors went critical, and the ship exploded in a brilliant flash that could be seen from Earth, and the shockwave destroyed two nearby frigates that were trying to form a defensive formation, and the debris from all three ships created even more hazards for the remaining vessel's captain. Jake Morrison piloted his fighter through the chaos, and his small craft was fast and agile, and the Vaxian targeting systems could not lock onto something so small, moving so erratically, and he lined up behind a damaged destroyer and fired his remaining missiles, and they struck the destroyer's exposed reactor core, and the ship disappeared in a ball of fire. And Jake pulled hard on his controls and dove away from the explosion, and his radio was full of voices as other human pilots called out targets and confirmed kills. The battle lasted 47 minutes, and when it was over, the Third Fleet was devastated, and bodies and wreckage floated in the darkness, and only 12 ships managed to escape, and they jumped into hyperspace in a panic and fled back toward Empire space, and the Eternal Dominion was one of the survivors. But it was badly damaged and limping, and Admiral Krelix stood among the ruins of the bridge and looked at the casualty reports, and he could barely comprehend what had happened. 200 ships had entered the human solar system, and 188 had been destroyed, and thousands of Vaxian warriors were dead, and the Empire had suffered its worst military defeat in recorded history, and it had been inflicted by a species that was supposed to be primitive and helpless. And Vaxtol sat in silence with his mandibles trembling, and he whispered, asking what kind of creatures these humans were. Krelix looked at him and said they were survivors, and they were fighters, and they were everything the Empire had forgotten how to be during 3,000 years of easy conquest, and the Empire had grown soft and comfortable and assumed their technology made them invincible. But the humans had just taught them a terrible lesson, which was that technology alone does not win wars, and tactics and determination and the willingness to sacrifice can overcome any advantage. The surviving ships jumped to hyperspace and left the human solar system. Behind and back on Earth, the defense forces monitored their retreat and confirmed they were gone, and cheers erupted in command centers around the planet, and people hugged each other and cried with relief because they had survived the first attack and they had won the first battle. But everyone knew this war was far from over. Linda Hayes stood and addressed the command center, and she told everyone they had done well, but they could not celebrate for long because the Empire would return and they would come back with more ships and better preparation, and humanity needed to use this time wisely, and they needed to build more weapons and improve their defenses, and most importantly, they needed to study the wreckage of the Vaxian ships, because those vessels contained technology that could help humanity survive what was coming next. Teams of scientists and engineers were already being dispatched to recover pieces of destroyed Vaxian ships, and they had strict orders to focus on the hyperdrive systems, because if humanity could learn to travel faster than light, then they would no longer be trapped in their own solar system, and they could take the fight to the Empire instead of waiting for the Empire to come to them. And this idea excited and terrified people in equal measure, because it meant humanity was about to take its first steps into a much larger and more dangerous galaxy. Jake Morrison landed his fighter on the Roosevelt and climbed out of the cockpit, and technicians rushed to refuel and rearm the craft because they knew more battles were coming, and Jake was exhausted. But he could not rest yet, and he walked through the ship's corridors and saw the faces of the crew, and they looked at him with hope and determination, and he realized that humanity had changed forever, and they had proven to themselves and to the galaxy that they would not be victims, and they would not surrender, and they would fight for their freedom, no matter the cost. On the Vaxian homeworld, the Grand Council received the news of the Third Fleet's destruction, and the chamber erupted in chaos, and some council members demanded immediate retaliation, while others called for caution, and Ambassador Krellix tried to make them understand that humanity was not a normal enemy, and they could not be defeated through conventional means. But many on the council refused to listen, because accepting defeat from primitives was unthinkable. High Chancellor Mixtar stood and called for order, and he said the Empire's reputation was at stake and they could not allow this insult to stand. And if one primitive species could defeat them, then others might try to rebel, and the entire Empire could collapse. And therefore, they needed to assemble an even larger fleet and crush humanity once and for all and show the galaxy that the Empire was still supreme. The Grand Council chamber was filled with tension and anger, as holographic projections showed the debris fields where the Third Fleet had died, and the images rotated slowly, displaying wreckage and frozen bodies drifting in the void. And High Chancellor Mixtar slammed 4 of his appendages against the council table and declared this was impossible, because no species had ever defeated the Empire in their first engagement, and certainly not a primitive race that barely understood the basics of space travel. Ambassador Krellix stood before the council and tried to make them understand the truth, and he said, humanity possessed something the Empire had underestimated, which was creativity born from endless warfare among themselves, and every weapon the humans used was simple and even crude by Empire standards. But they deployed those weapons with perfect tactical precision, and they did not try to match Vaxian technology, because they knew they could not win that way, and instead, they exploited the Empire's assumptions and arrogance. Supreme Admiral Zexkor rose from her seat and her scales shimmered with rage, and she said she would take command of the First and Second Fleets, which together numbered 500 vessels, and she would reduce the human planet to ash and glass, and there would be nothing left but a warning to any other species that dared to challenge the Empire. And she spoke with absolute confidence because she believed overwhelming force would solve this problem. Krellix said no, and the word hung in the air and shocked the council into silence, because nobody had ever directly contradicted a Supreme Admiral in such a manner, and he continued saying that sending another fleet was exactly what the humans expected, and they had studied warfare for their entire existence. And while the Empire had fought perhaps 5 major conflicts in 3,000 years, humanity had waged thousands of wars, and they did not fear death, and they would embrace it if it served their larger strategy. High Chancellor Mixtar demanded to know what Krellix suggested instead, and his tone was mocking and angry, and Krellick said they should retrieve their own people and return the abducted humans and negotiate a peace treaty before this situation escalated beyond control, and the council erupted in outrage because surrender was not in the Vaxian vocabulary, and the Empire did not negotiate with prey species, and they had never backed down from a fight in 3,000 years. The debate raged for hours, but in the end, the council voted to proceed with the military option, and they convinced themselves that the first defeat was a fluke, and the humans had simply gotten lucky, and once the Empire brought sufficient force to bear, the outcome would be inevitable. And Krellick watched them make this decision, and he knew they were wrong, but he could not stop them, and he wondered how many more Vaxians would die before the council accepted reality. 3 days later, Supreme Admiral Zexcor stood on the bridge of her flagship called the Vengeance Eternal, and around her in space floated 500 warships representing the largest military force the Empire had assembled in 2 centuries. And every vessel was at maximum combat readiness, and the crews had been briefed on human tactics, and all defensive systems had been recalibrated, and scout ships would screen ahead to prevent ambushes, and Zexcor was confident that this time there would be no surprises. The fleet jumped into hyperspace and began the journey to Earth, and Zexcor reviewed the battle plans, and she had divided her forces into multiple groups that would enter the human solar system from different angles, and they would overwhelm any defenses through sheer numbers and firepower. And she had also ordered that no mercy be shown, and any human military forces would be destroyed completely, and any civilians who resisted would share the same fate. Ambassador Krellick was aboard the Eternal Dominion, which had been repaired and attached to Zexcor's fleet, and he stood in the observation deck and looked out at the assembled warships, and he felt deep dread, because he knew the humans would not simply wait to be destroyed, and they would have spent every moment since the last battle preparing for this moment. And he tried one more time to convince Zexcor to reconsider, but she dismissed his concerns with contempt. On Earth, the governments and military leaders had indeed been preparing, and Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center deep beneath the Colorado mountains, and he was coordinating with defense forces across the planet, and around him, dozens of screens showed strategic positions throughout the solar system, and the mood was tense but determined, because everyone knew the Empire would return with overwhelming force. Commander Linda Hayes reviewed intelligence reports, and she said their scouts had detected the approaching fleet, and it was much larger than the first one, and they were coming in multiple groups, which showed they had learned from their previous mistakes. And Jake nodded and said, then humanity needed to show them something new, and teach them that adapting to human tactics was like trying to hit a moving target that kept changing direction. Colonel Paul Grant spoke from his station, and he said the defenses were ready, and they had spent 3 weeks converting every available resource into weapons and mining. Vessels had been turned into missile platforms, and colony haulers now carried drone swarms, and even commercial ships had been armed with improvised kinetic weapons. And the solar system had been turned into the largest minefield in history. But the real surprise was something else entirely, and deep in a secure facility. Engineer Nicole Peters and her team had been working around the clock with almost no sleep, and they had been studying the wreckage of Vaxian ships recovered from the first battle. And specifically, they had focused on the hyperdrive technology, and Nicole was exhausted and her hands shook from too much caffeine. But her eyes were bright with excitement, because they had done something impossible. Nicole stood before a holographic projection showing a crude but functional hyperdrive design, and she explained to Jake and Linda that they had reverse-engineered the basic principles, and it was dangerous and unstable, and it might only work once, but it would work, and humanity now had the ability to travel faster than light, and the implications were staggering because it meant they were no longer trapped in their solar system. Jake asked how many ships they could equip with this technology, and Nicole said they had built 50 hyperdrive units using parts scavenged from the Vaxian wrecks, and they had installed them in whatever vessels could handle the modifications, which meant mostly military ships, but also some converted freighters, and the drives had not been tested extensively because there was no time, but computer simulations suggested they would function at least long enough for one. Linda smiled and said 1 jump was all they needed, and she outlined a plan that was audacious and terrifying, and it would require perfect timing and a lot of luck. But if it worked, they would turn the Empire's own strategy against them. And Jake listened, and then approved the plan, and orders were sent out to all human forces throughout the solar system. The Vaxian fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the human solar system, and they came in 3 separate groups as planned, and their sensors immediately began scanning for threats. And Admiral Zexcor was pleased to see that. The orbital space around Earth appeared mostly empty, and there were no massive concentrations of missiles or defensive platforms, and she thought perhaps the humans had exhausted their resources in the first battle. Krellick stood beside her, and he said quietly that it was a trap, and the emptiness was too convenient and the humans were hiding something. But Zexcor ignored him and ordered the fleet to advance in formation and maintain maximum alert, and the 500 ships began moving toward Earth like a wall of steel and fire. The fleet moved deeper into the system and past the outer planets, and nothing happened, and some of the crew members began to relax slightly and think that maybe the humans had given up or fled. And then, suddenly alarms began blaring and sensors detected multiple launches, but not from Earth, and instead from the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and from hidden bases on Europa, and Titan and Enceladus missiles and drones poured out from these concealed positions, and they swarmed toward the Vaxian fleet, and Zexcor ordered defensive formations, and her ships began shooting down the incoming weapons. And the point defense systems worked better this time because they had been recalibrated, but there were still too many targets and some got through and ships began taking damage. But this attack was just a distraction, and the real threat came from an entirely unexpected direction, and suddenly hyperspace portals opened behind the Vaxian fleet, and 50 human ships emerged at point-blank range, and they were crewed vessels with unstable drives. But they were also loaded with every weapon humanity could pack into them. The human ships opened fire before the Vaxians could react, and missiles and kinetic rounds tore into the rear of the enemy formation, and several destroyers exploded immediately, and the rest of the fleet tried to turn to face this new threat, but they were packed too tightly together, and their formations became chaos, and human ships darted between them, firing at close range before vanishing behind debris. Jake Morrison piloted his fighter through the maelstrom, and his small craft weaved between massive Vaxian cruisers, and he fired his missiles into engine clusters and weak points, and all around him human pilots fought with desperate courage, and some of them flew damaged ships directly into enemy vessels when their weapons ran out, and the Grand Council received the news of the Second Fleet's destruction, and the chamber fell into a stunned silence that lasted for several minutes, and nobody could speak, because the reality of what had happened was too enormous to comprehend, and the Empire had lost nearly 800 warships in 2 battles against a species that did not even have proper interstellar technology, and the implications were terrifying. High Chancellor Mixtar sat frozen in his seat, and his 4 eyes were dim with shock, and he whispered, asking how this was possible. And Ambassador Krellick stood before the council, and he spoke quietly, and he said this was possible because the Empire had grown arrogant and complacent during 3,000 years of unchallenged rule, and they had forgotten that technology alone does not win wars, and humans possessed something the Empire had lost, which was the ability to adapt and innovate and sacrifice. One of the council members demanded to know what they should do now and suggested assembling an even larger fleet, and Krellick laughed bitterly and said they could assemble 10,000 ships, and the result would be the same because the problem was not numbers, and the problem was that humanity learned faster than the Empire could respond, and they turned every defeat into a lesson and every victory into an opportunity. Another council member asked fearfully if the humans would attack the Empire's core worlds, and Krellick said that was exactly what would happen if they did not negotiate peace immediately, and he reminded them that humanity had captured Vaxian ships and studied the technology, and they had reverse-engineered hyperdrive capability in less than 3 weeks, and he asked the council how long they thought it would take humans to build a proper fleet. Now that they understood the principles, the council erupted in debate, and some members still wanted to fight while others recognized the hopelessness of the situation, and Mixtar tried to maintain order, but he was clearly shaken, and he had built his entire political career on the Empire's military supremacy, and now that foundation was crumbling beneath him. Ambassador Krellick said they needed to face reality, and the reality was that humanity had won this war, and the only question remaining was how much more the Empire would lose before admitting defeat. and he said they should send a diplomatic mission to Earth and negotiate terms while they still had something to negotiate with, because if the humans reached the Empire's core, worlds first, then the terms would be much harsher. The debate continued for hours, but slowly the Council came to accept that they had no good options, and Supreme Admiral Zexcor had returned in disgrace, and she sat silently in her seat and refused to meet anyone's eyes. And the other military commanders were equally subdued because they understood that their entire strategic doctrine had been rendered obsolete by human tactics. Meanwhile, on Earth, the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that the war was not over yet, and Captain Jake Morrison stood with Commander Linda Hayes, and they reviewed footage of the second battle and analyzed what had worked and what could be improved, and they knew the Empire might still send more fleets and humanity needed to be ready. But there was also excitement in the air because engineer Nicole Peters and her team had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, and the crude hyperdrives had worked, and 50 human ships had traveled faster than light and returned safely. And now humanity had proven they could take the fight beyond their solar system, and the strategic implications were revolutionary. Colonel Paul Grant entered the command center, and he carried a data pad, and he said their analysis of captured Vaxian ships had revealed something interesting, and the Empire's vessels were actually vulnerable in several ways that could be exploited, and their shields were optimized against energy weapons but weaker against kinetic impacts, and their sensors had blind spots, and their crews relied heavily on automated systems that could be jammed or hacked. Linda asked how long it would take to build proper warships using combined human and Vaxian technology, and Nicole said if they had access to the right materials and manufacturing facilities, they could have prototype vessels ready in 6 months and production models in a year, and this timeline shocked everyone because it was incredibly fast. But Nicole explained that humanity had been preparing for this moment, and every nation had converted their industrial capacity to military production. Jake said they needed to think bigger, and they needed to consider what came after the war, and he asked what kind of galaxy they wanted to live in and whether they wanted to simply defeat the Empire or change the entire structure of galactic civilization. And Linda said they should aim for the latter, because if they only defeated the Empire, then some other species would eventually rise to take their place, and the cycle of domination would continue. The discussion was interrupted by an incoming transmission, and it was from the Vaxian Empire, and the message was addressed to the leaders of humanity. And everyone in the command center fell silent as the transmission played, and Ambassador Krellix appeared on the screen, and his 3 eyes showed weariness and resignation. Krellix said he was speaking on behalf of the Grand Council, and they wished to discuss terms for ending hostilities, and he acknowledged that humanity had proven their military capabilities, and the Empire was prepared to negotiate a settlement, and he requested that human representatives meet with Vaxian diplomats at a neutral location to discuss terms. Jake and Linda looked at each other, and they both smiled, because this was exactly what they had hoped for, and the Empire had finally accepted reality, and Jake said they should respond, but they should not meet at a neutral location, and instead they should dictate where the meeting would take place, and Linda understood immediately, and she said they should demand the meeting take place on Vaxia Prime itself. The response was sent, and the Vaxian Council was shocked by the demand, but after much debate they agreed because they had no leverage to refuse, and 6 weeks after the second battle, a human ship entered orbit around the Vaxian homeworld, and this was the first time any human had visited the Empire's capital planet. And the symbolism was not lost on anyone. Captain Jake Morrison and Commander Linda Hayes stood on the bridge of their vessel, and they looked down at the alien world below, and it was beautiful in its own way, with purple oceans and silver cities and rings of orbital stations, and this was the heart of an empire that had ruled for 3,000 years, and now humans had reached it, and the Empire trembled. They transported down to the surface using Vaxian technology, and they materialized in the Grand Council chamber, and the council members recoiled slightly at seeing humans in person for the first time, and Jake and Linda stood confidently, and they wore their military uniforms, and they carried themselves like conquerors, even though they were only 2 people surrounded by an empire of trillions. High Chancellor Mixtar tried to maintain dignity, and he welcomed them, formally, and said they were there to discuss terms for peace, and Jake said no. They were there to discuss terms for surrender, and the distinction was important, and the council members shifted uncomfortably because no species had ever spoken to them this way. Linda activated a holographic display and it showed Vaxia Prime in perfect detail, and every military installation was highlighted, and every orbital platform was marked, and every defensive system was catalogued, and even the council's own underground bunker was shown with precise coordinates, and she said humanity had been watching them for 3 days and mapping every asset and weakness. Jake said humanity could destroy everything the Empire had built, and they had the capability, and the weapons and the determination to do it, but they had not come for conquest and they had come for justice. And he listed their demands, and first was the immediate return of all 17 abducted humans alive and unharmed, and second was a formal apology and reparations for violating human sovereignty. The third demand was a non-aggression pact that recognized humanity's borders and their right to self-determination, and the fourth demand was trade agreements that treated humans as equals and not as subjects or primitives. And finally, humanity demanded that the Empire begin the process of liberating all species that were held as slaves or vassals, and allow them to choose their own governments. The council erupted in protest, and Supreme Admiral Zexacor demanded to know what would happen if they refused, and Jake's expression hardened, and he said then humanity would do what they had done throughout their entire history when faced with tyrants and oppressors, and they would fight and they would adapt and they would sacrifice and they would win, no matter how long it took or how much it cost. Linda added that every human alive had volunteered for this war, and every single one had been willing to die if necessary. And she said when the Empire took those 17 people, they made it personal, and humanity does not forgive those who harm their own. And they protect each other, and they remember every wrong committed against them. Ambassador Krelix stepped forward, and he said he recommended the council accept these terms, and he said humanity had proven they could defeat the Empire militarily, and more importantly, they had proven they would never stop fighting, and the Empire could either accept peace, now while they still had a civilization to preserve, or they could continue fighting until there was nothing left. The council chamber fell silent, and the members looked at each other, and Captain Jake Morrison and Commander Linda Hayes returned to Earth as heroes, and millions of people gathered in cities across the planet to celebrate the end of the war and the safe return of the 17 abducted citizens and humanity had faced the most powerful empire in the galaxy and forced them to negotiate peace, and the victory seemed impossible. But it had happened, and the world rejoiced. But Jake and Linda knew the truth, which was that the war had not really ended, and it had only changed form, and the galaxy was full of dangerous species, and many of them would view humanity as a threat now, and others would see humans as potential allies or tools to use against their own enemies, and Earth had taken its first steps into a much larger and more complex political landscape. The 17 returned humans were taken to medical facilities for examination and treatment, and they had been held by the Vaxians for over a year and subjected to various experiments and tests, but they were alive and mostly healthy, and their stories of captivity were broadcast across Earth, and the details made people angry and reinforced the belief that humanity had been right to fight. Engineer Nicole Peters and her team were given access to the technological reparations that the Empire had provided, and it included detailed schematics for hyperdrive systems and energy shields, and advanced materials and weapons technology. And Nicole said this would accelerate human development by decades and maybe even centuries, and they could now build ships that matched anything in the galaxy. The United Earth Defense Force began an expansion program, and volunteers flooded recruitment centers, and new ships were laid down in orbital shipyards, and the designs incorporated both human ingenuity and alien technology. And the result was vessels that were faster and more powerful than anything humanity had built before, but they also retained the tactical flexibility and adaptability that had won the war. Jake was promoted to admiral and given command of the first true interstellar warship, which was named the Defender, and it was sleek and deadly and incorporated lessons learned from 2 brutal battles, and Linda was made his executive officer, and together they would lead humanity's first deep space exploration mission and establish contact with other species beyond Empire territory. Colonel Paul Grant took charge of Earth's defensive networks, and he oversaw the construction of new orbital platforms and planetary shields and weapon systems because even though the Empire had agreed to peace, there was no guarantee they would honor that agreement forever, and humanity needed to remain vigilant and ready. The treaty with the Empire had included provisions for human observers to monitor the liberation of subjugated species, and Ambassador Krellix worked with human diplomats to begin this process, and it was slow and difficult because many of the Empire's subject species did not trust that freedom was real and they feared this was some kind of trick. But gradually, species began to declare independence, and they formed their own governments, and some of them reached out to humanity for advice and assistance, and Earth found itself becoming a center of political activity and a symbol of resistance against tyranny. And this was a role nobody had expected, but humanity embraced it. The Vaxian Empire began to fracture and splinter as more species broke away, and the Grand Council tried to hold things together, but their authority was eroding, and High Chancellor Mixtar resigned in disgrace and was replaced by a reformist who promised to transform the Empire into a voluntary confederation of equals. But many people doubted this would work. Ambassador Krellix traveled to Earth and met with human leaders, and he said he wanted to thank them personally for forcing the Empire to change, and he admitted that he had feared humanity from the beginning, because he recognized something in them that his own people had lost, and that something was the fire of freedom and the refusal to accept domination. Jake asked Krellix what he thought would happen to the Empire, and Krellix said honestly he did not know, and the Empire might collapse completely or it might transform into something new and better, and either way the galaxy would never be the same, and humanity had changed everything by refusing to surrender. Months passed, and the Defender completed its construction, and it was time for humanity's first mission beyond their own region of space. And Jake stood on the bridge with Linda, and they looked at the crew, which was composed of volunteers from every nation on Earth. And these people represented the best of humanity, and they were ready to explore the galaxy. The ship departed from Earth orbit, and thousands of people watched from the surface, and the Defender accelerated and then jumped into hyperspace and vanished in a flash of blue light, and they were heading toward unexplored regions of the galaxy where humanity had never gone before. Their first stop was a small independent world that had recently broken free from Empire control, and the species there were called the Krelin, and they were cautious but curious about humans, and Jake and Linda met with their leaders and offered friendship and trade, and the Krelin were surprised that humanity did not demand tribute or allegiance. One of the Krelin elders asked why humans had fought the Empire when it would have been easier to submit and accept their place as a minor species. And Jake said humanity had learned long ago that freedom was worth any price, and that living on your knees was not really living at all, and the elder seemed to understand and nodded slowly. The Defender continued its journey and visited several more worlds, and everywhere they went, humans offered the same message, which was that the age of empires was ending, and the age of cooperation was beginning, and species should be free to determine their own destiny. And this message resonated with many who had lived under oppression, but not everyone welcomed humanity's presence, and some species viewed humans as dangerous radicals who threatened the established order, and others saw them as weak because they offered friendship instead of conquest. And there were several incidents where human ships were attacked by pirates or hostile governments. The Defender fought off these attacks, and each time they proved that humanity was not weak, and they could defend themselves and their allies, and word spread across the galaxy that humans were formidable warriors but also honorable, and they kept their promises and treated others with respect. Back on Earth, new technologies were being implemented, and cities were powered by fusion reactors based on Vaxian designs, and shields protected major population centers from potential attacks. And humanity was becoming a true spacefaring civilization and not just a species confined to one world. Nicole Peters led a team that was designing the next generation of human warships, and these vessels would be even more advanced, and they would incorporate innovations that went beyond what the Empire had achieved. And Nicole said humanity's advantage was that they were not bound by tradition or established doctrine, and they could think in new ways. The United Earth government established the Department of Interstellar Relations, and its mission was to manage humanity's growing diplomatic ties with dozens of alien species, and the department worked to build alliances and trade agreements and mutual defense pacts, and Earth was becoming a center of galactic politics, 3. Years after the war ended, Jake and Linda returned to Earth, and they brought representatives from 20 different species who wanted to meet with human leaders and discuss forming a new interstellar organization that would be based on equality and mutual respect rather than domination and fear. The conference was held at the United Earth headquarters, and delegates from across the galaxy gathered, and they debated and argued and negotiated, and finally they agreed to form the Galactic Coalition for Free Worlds, and the charter stated that every species had the right to self-determination, and no species could impose their will on another through force. The coalition was small at first, with only 30 member species, but it grew quickly as more worlds joined, and the Vaxian Empire watched nervously because they understood that this coalition represented an alternative to their model of governance, and if it succeeded, then the Empire would become irrelevant. Admiral Jake Morrison was offered the position of Supreme Commander of the Coalition's military forces, but he declined, and he said humanity should not dominate this new organization, and instead the position should rotate among species so that everyone had a voice. And his decision impressed many delegates who had worried that humans would try to replace the Empire. As the dominant power, Jake returned to active duty aboard the Defender, and he continued exploring unknown regions of space and making contact with new species and telling them about the coalition and offering friendship, and every system he visited changed a little bit because humans brought with them the idea that things did not have to be the way they had always been. Commander Linda Hayes eventually became captain of her own ship, and she led exploration missions into regions that were considered too dangerous by other species, and she discovered 3 new civilizations and helped negotiate peace between 2 warring factions, and her name became known across the galaxy. The years passed and humanity continued to grow and expand, and they established colonies on dozens of worlds and built trading stations and research outposts and military bases, and they shared their technology with allies and learned from other species, and the exchange of knowledge benefited everyone. The Vaxian Empire never recovered its former power and influence, and